New Thought Media Network is proud to present New Thought's Roots and Branches with Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller. Join us every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Mountain Time. Tune in live or watch anytime on our YouTube channel. Discover the rich history of New Thought and its impact on modern spirituality. Join Reverend Dr. Ruth Miller as she shares insights, stories, and teachings that inspire and uplift. Experience deep insights and transformative teachings that connect you to the roots of New Thought. Visit our YouTube channel to catch up on past episodes and join us live every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Connect with us and be part of the journey.
Hi there, I am Ruth Miller, and this is New Thought Roots and Branches, where we explore the lives and the teachings of the many, many, many generations of people who have brought to us this marvelous movement that is known as New Thought. This week, we're going to look at someone who is not in the traditional lineage. He's nowhere on our graphs. This is Neville Goddard, and many people know him simply as Neville. And that's who I first was introduced to through one of my students in one of my churches that I was working in very early on. And she had this book, and she was just raving about this Neville guy. And so I started doing some research, and well, he absolutely embodies the principles of what we call New Thought. If we look at our chart of the history of the movement in the next slide, we can see he's not on it, nowhere on it. There is no direct lineage for him, although indirectly he did come into contact with someone who had studied with Thomas Troward, who's way over there on the edge, in England when he was in England, and we'll talk about that shortly. So in the next slide, where we have all the founders of all the centers, again, no Neville Goddard. But Neville was a 20th century teacher who had a profound impact on the 20th century. So let's look at this guy, this incredible man. He was first on the East Coast. He was working in New York as a lecturer and writer, and then he moved out to Los Angeles. And so the early picture was one of his headshots in the New York area, and the later picture is one of his more expanded shots, shall we say, showing his intellectual qualities in the Los Angeles area in the 50s and 60s. Neville was not an American citizen initially. If we look at his early life and education in the next slide, we find out that he was born on the edge of the town of St. Michael's on Barbados in 1905. So he's fully 20th century. And his father, as many people did in the Indies at that time, produced rum. And his father went on to become quite wealthy. But at the time when Neville was beginning to function in the world, his father was just normal middle class. Neville moved to New York and was a dancer, a chorus line dancer at 17. So that made it 1922. And he was standard burlesque and musicals and all those kinds of things from 17 on, very young to be moving from the islands into the city. And one of the companies that he signed on with toured England. And that was where he discovered metaphysics as a whole from one of Troward's teachers and some other people there. And he was told about the Rosicrucians. When he came back in 23 to New York, he actually was connected to a Rosicrucian community there. Now, the Brotherhood or the Community of the Rosy Cross, which is the actual name of the Rosicrucians, are ancient in the sense that they're from the Middle Ages. They're about 1,000 years old. as a group of folks who were breaking away from the traditional teachings of the Christian church, traditional teachings of the Catholic Church in particular, and were saying, no, there's a lot more to what Jesus was teaching and a lot more to his life than the doctrine of the church. They were very interested in the metaphysical aspects, and they were also very much aware of the way that Jesus' teachings were an extension of teachings that were present in Egypt long before Jesus was born. And in fact, many people say that the Emerald Tablet was made known to Westerners by the early Rosicrucians. So he connects with the Rosicrucians, and he marries one of the women in the company, Mildred Hughes, in 1923. Later, we find out that, we knew immediately that this wasn't going to work. However, she was pregnant. She had a son and they named him Joseph, which is after Neville's father, in 1924. And they lived separately for the next 14 years. After several years, she sent the boy to go live with his father. So Neville was raising his son through the 1930s, and his estranged wife was just living life on her own terms. And those terms were very interesting, which we may touch in. He had a basement apartment on West 75th Street on Manhattan and was working as a dancer. So he was going down to Times Square and over to Fifth Avenue and to the various stages and companies around the city. And that caused him to pass a building on 72nd Street. In that building was a very tall, very self-contained Black man that he addressed himself or named himself as Rabbi Abdullah, and that was 1929. In the next slide, we hear what Neville has to say about this man. He says, if I were called upon to name a man that I would consider my teacher, I would name Abdullah. That doesn't mean that he didn't study elsewhere, but this is the man who was his teacher. And Neville was fascinated with him because he was at least in his late 80s. And he says he did everything. He ate everything. He drank everything. He didn't smoke only because he didn't enjoy it, but he did everything. An old man. He was then in his late 80s when I met him. He says, I studied with Abdullah for 7 years in New York City, 7 days a week. We were inseparable. Well, those were the years of the Depression, and nobody was buying dancers after the crash of 29. So there wasn't a whole lot of work that Neville could be doing, and he used the time to study with Abdullah. Neville says that Abdullah was born in Ethiopia, of the Negro race in the Hebraic faith. And you may be aware that there is a whole sect of Jews, a whole tribe of Jews really, in Ethiopia, and that many of the people that moved into Israel after the nation was formed were Ethiopian Jews who were moving away from the Ethiopian Christians. And some of you may be aware that there is a strong tradition that the Jewish Ark of the Covenant is in an Ethiopian temple buried somewhere in the country. In the next slide, we get to see where Neville and Abdullah met. And it turns out this little building on West 72nd Street, is where the Anthroposophic Press was located. That is to say, this was an occult center. This was a place where a lot of interesting thing happens. The Saturday Evening Spiritual Club was the Theosophists as well. And Rabbi Abdullah always met Neville there. Neville kind of had the opinion that Abdullah actually lived there. We know that he would move from one side of the building to another side of the building for different qualities of experience because of the different kinds of interactions they had. Well, Abdullah and Neville began to make sense of the questions that Neville would be asking. And in the next slide, Abdullah would say to Neville, I picked up this garment 90 odd years ago in Ethiopia, his body. And Neville tells us that Abdullah lived to be over 100 and had one consuming desire to put that body back where he picked it up, which was in Ethiopia. So in 1964, Neville traveled back to New York, and he said, the last time I met Abdullah was about 8 years ago in New York. And about 7 years ago, I met his secretary, and she voiced that request of his and said he was planning to return to Ethiopia. I haven't seen or heard from Abdullah or the secretary since. So in 1957 is the last time that Abdullah and Neville were in conversation. That's quite a while, 1929 to 1957. And he was 80-ish when they began their conversations. So what were these conversations? Well, one of the most powerful teachings that Neville offers is demonstrated in the next slide. Neville, in the 30s, was beginning to realize that he wanted to go home to see his mother. He wanted to go to the Barbados. But again, he had no income, nobody was hiring dancers, and he had not saved anything when he was dancing. So Abdullah said, you can do that. He advised him to, quote, be in Barbados, regardless of the appearances. Taught him to imagine it vividly, to assume that he had it. And any time that Neville would show up to visit him and start talking about going to Barbados, literally, Abdullah would leave, go into the other room, and ignore him completely. And one time, when Neville came up to him and started talking about it, Abdullah looked at him and said, you are in Barbados. And slowly, Neville got the idea. In order to experience it in the physical, he had to experience it completely and thoroughly in the mental. Now, we've heard aspects of that from all our teachers along the whole way of feeling it already at hand. You know, Jesus telling us the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Yes? Yes. Feeling it, knowing it, not allowing any other possibility. And this is what's making Neville so popular today on YouTube and in many other places where people are trying to get information about how to live a life that works for them, right? Well, in New York, we'll look at the next slide. Something happened. Remember, that was 7 years of inseparable with Abdullah, 1929 through 1937. And then one day along the way, he had met another woman that he knew he wanted to be married to. But because the laws of divorce in the 30s were very, very difficult, he didn't see any way to make that shift. But one day, he said, he woke up and he got a call that he had to go down to the courthouse. And he couldn't understand why in 1938. And finally, someone told him that his wife, his estranged wife, had been caught shoplifting, and he needed to come down and deal with this. Well, they were married, and so technically in the 1930s, he was responsible for his wife's behavior. So he headed down to the courthouse, and it turned out that she had been accused, not only accused of shoplifting, but there was some evidence supporting it. And he proceeded to offer this remarkable argument why the court should not put her in jail, why they should not hold any counts against her, because she was dealing with mental issues, she was emotionally unstable, and any behaviors that happened were the result of the instability. And he went on and on and on. And when he was done, the judge looked at him and said, I have never in all my years heard an estranged husband describe his wife and defend her in these terms. And he dismissed the charges. As they walked out of the courtroom, his former wife, Mildred, said, hand me the papers, the divorce papers, I will sign them. That was her thank you. after 7 years, or almost 14 years, 14 years of them not being actually together, but officially married. So, of course, he didn't have the papers with him, but they did go back to his apartment. And even though it was illegal for him to serve them directly, he was supposed to do it through a third party, he allowed it to happen. She signed the papers and he was free. And what's really interesting to me is that's when he launched his career. So after he's completed his term of instruction with Abdullah, he suddenly is freed in his marriage, and he moves on to his next career. 7 years. That's a biblical epic for what it's worth. Well, that very first year, he rented the Actors Temple, which I think is interesting, delivered a lecture based on what he had studied and read from the Rosicrucians and Troward and the people in England, and what Abdullah was teaching him. And he published a book. He self-published it, establishing Goddard Press. Now, we heard a similar thing with Joel Goldsmith. Joel Goldsmith started out on the East Coast, and he published his first book. And remember, we heard the same thing with the Holmes brothers. As they started to lecture, they started publishing their writings, partly to help support the lectures, right? You'd sell the writings, and that would help pay for the lectures. So he got his first book out in 1938. He did his first lecture. And the woman that he had fallen in love with was Catherine. And she was a set designer. He was able to go back to dancing during the war. He married Catherine, however, when he got drafted. He was drafted and sent to a camp in Louisiana, was there for 9 months in 1942, and discharged with an honorable discharge, after which he became a U.S. citizen. That was one of the ways, and still is, to become a U.S. citizen. That is to serve in the U.S. military. And for those of you who are paying attention to the weird things that are going on with immigration and such in the country today, that's an important piece to be aware of. Well, he continued to stay with Catherine for a few more years, and then moved on because she did not want to go back to New York. She wanted to stay where she was. So he went back to New York, and he lectured at what is called the Town Hall in Manhattan, and began to build his following with his book and with his lectures. And his topic was imagination plus faith. And isn't that what Abdullah had taught him? You know it, you feel it so completely that you know it is so. Those of you who remember Emma Curtis Hopkins' teachings, she said that what we believe in so far deep down that we know it to be so is what we have faith in. So imagination plus faith began to be the key to Neville's teachings. The following year, he moved to Los Angeles. And remember, the same thing happened with a couple of other of our folks, right? They ended up moving to LA. It was the big thing to do. If you were interested in moving things forward in any way, in the arts, in the sciences, or in metaphysics, you moved out to the West Coast, and particularly LA. And the Santa Fe Railroad was using advertisements and movies on TV to get people to do this, which I think is fascinating. I've never seen this for any other town in the 20th century. So he moves to LA, and we can see in the next slide how he begins to get started in LA. This is an LA paper, and there in the highlighted little white box, that's his ad for his first lecture. And it's based on the new book that he just produced, Awakened Imagination. That is what it's about. So this is the El Sereno Star, which is actually a suburb of LA, in 1955. And that's the sort of thing he would do. And he would attract initially dozens and then hundreds and ultimately thousands of people to his lectures. In fact, in the next slide, we'll see that he actually ended up with a TV show because he had so many lectures, people attending his lectures. He completed 6 more books in the 50s. His TV channel, his TV station, was on Sunday afternoon. He had a full season, but they weren't able to find advertisers that were comfortable with what it was he was teaching. Or it may have been the other way around. He may not have been comfortable with the people who are willing to advertise it. So after 1 season, the show was canceled. If you go onto YouTube today and you look up Neville or Neville Goddard, you will see at least hear some of those TV shows. There's a lot of them being broadcast on YouTube today. Well, there were 26. I've only seen 6 or 7 online, but I'll bet there's a lot more than that. And what he would do is he'd just speak extemporaneously. He would sit there with that pipe, lean back, and he would talk, oh, well, I have had this question about so-and-so and such and such. And as I understand it, it would be such like, that kind of extemporaneous presentation. People loved it, 300,000 viewers, but they couldn't get the advertising. How many shows have we seen not continue after a season or 2 simply because no one was willing to fund them, even though thousands of people were watching them? Well, that was Neville's experience, which is interesting to me because it tells me that he actually was more comfortable in front of groups than in front of a camera. Because with those technologies that he was using, those techniques and methods that he was using, he could have been doing anything. But I think he was either unconsciously or maybe even consciously choosing to be in front of people rather than a camera. During the 1950s, he published a bunch of books, which are in the next slide, and you can find them just about anywhere online. The one up in the corner, the pale blue one, was that very first book that he published, and the others were based on talks. He would develop a talk and it would turn into a book. And very much like what the other people have done in this marvelous world of New Thought. His concepts were fundamentally based in that idea. We have to be the experience in order to have it become our physical experience. And we can see some of that in the teachings in the next few slides. From his book, Your Faith is Your Fortune. You can see how imagination and faith becomes your faith is your fortune, right? And this is a very important teaching of Neville's. It kind of gets buried sometimes in the New Thought world and definitely gets buried in the activist world out there. But this is what he's telling us. Stop trying to change the world, since it is only the mirror. You may recall that Charles said, if you see something out there that needs to be changed or fixed, you change it in here. And that's what Neville is saying. The second point, man's attempt to change the world by force is as fruitless as breaking a mirror in the hope of changing his face. Isn't that marvelous? If I'm seeing things out there that are not okay, then I don't need to change that. I need to change this, yeah? And then he says, leave the mirror, change your face. Leave the world alone, change your conceptions of yourself. What? What have I got to do with what's going on out there, right? If I believe that I have ever done anything wrong, I will see it in the world around me. If I believe that I have been wronged and people have done things to me that are not okay, I will see it in the world around me. Oh my goodness, I have some beliefs to get rid of. If I believe that it's possible for me or anyone else to, sin, be sick, be poor, any of those things, guess what? I'm going to see it in the world. So he says, change your conceptions of yourself. Who do you think you are? Who do you think you are in the world? How do you think the world relates to you? Change those things in order, as he says, to have the reflection be satisfactory. Now, we know there are a lot of people in the world of sales and corporate development who get up in the morning and while they're grooming, they're doing their affirmations, tying their tie or doing their hair or whatever, doing their affirmations, better and better every day. I'm accomplishing what I need to accomplish today. The universe is on my side, all kinds of affirmations. And that is useful, but it's not changing our conception of ourselves. And that's where Neville has been trying to take us all that time, since the 1950s. If we look at the next slide, it's from his book, Feeling is the Secret. And he says, consciousness is the one and only reality. Okay, this is the 1950s, so quantum science has begun to emerge. The idea of consciousness has been out there more and more with the work of Carl Jung, a little bit of Joseph Campbell in the 50s and 60s. And in the 60s, we're as far along as Charles Tart and some of the other consciousness researchers. So he's got it. Consciousness is the one and only reality. In Science of Mind, Ernest was saying there is, all that is the one mind, right? So not figuratively, he says, but actually. So speaking to people in the corporate world or in suburban LA, he is saying, this is not a metaphor. This is the reality. And then he says, this reality may, for the sake of clarity, be likened unto a stream, which is divided into two parts, the conscious and the subconscious. Now, I would say the conscious and the unconscious, because the unconscious isn't just the sub, it's also the super. But he's trying to get in touch with something in particular here, and he's using the Thomas Troward language, okay? The conscious, he says, is personal and selective. The subconscious is impersonal and non-selective. If you've ever heard the idea, don't say no about something because the subconscious doesn't hear it, that is part of what Neville is suggesting. He actually had a teaching he used to do. He would say, tell yourself several times tonight, relax and get into that nice, relaxed place where you're almost asleep, and then repeat several times, I will not climb a ladder, I will not climb a ladder, I will not climb a ladder, while you're in that state of consciousness. And then imagine climbing a ladder. What he's encouraging is if you do that for 2 or 3 days, almost invariably, a ladder will show up either in your dream or in your physical experience for you to climb. And you will find yourself climbing that ladder. And he uses that to help people understand what we are saying, especially with a negative in it, doesn't have anywhere near the impact as what we imagine or what we feel ourselves doing. All right. So in the next slide, he explains this a little further. And he's saying that whenever we are saying anything about anything, we have to be very, very, very clear. Okay. The statement, I will not climb a ladder, right, is a confession I am not. So you're actually saying will, there's a double negative there. But if you're saying, I will be quite wealthy, or I will be a famous writer, or I will be whatever, you're saying, I am not right now. Whoops. What Neville is pointing out, and again, this is very much in alignment with what all of our New Thought teachers are saying. The Father's will, the infinite will, the consciousness that is all that is always I am. It's always yes. It is now what it can be, and is unfolding in new possibilities that we can't even imagine. But the Father's will is always I am, right? And then he goes on to say, until you realize that you are the Father, your will is always I will be. And in parenthesis, there is only one I am. Your infinite self is that I am. I am that I am. I am that I am. I am that I am. Any will that I express is the expression of the infinite. Woo! And again, Holmes was very clear about this in saying that what we are declaring is what the one mind of all beingness is always declaring. And that's a big part of practicing the method, accepting that we are. We can't be separated from. We are not individualized, separated beings. We are the power. We are the presence. We are the force. We are the love. We are the light. We are the wealth. We are the health and the well-being. That is who and what we are. We realize that. We realize that. Realize means make real in our awareness. Then we get, as he calls that book, the power of the awareness. So in the next slide, knowing that what I am thinking in the conscious mind is what impresses on the subconscious, right? The subconscious receives the ideas and gives the form and expression to them. He's using that language that Troward used. And today we would say the unconscious mind receives the ideas and gives form and expression to them. And then he says, by this law, first conceiving an idea, then impressing the idea that's been conceived on the other consciousness, all things evolve out of consciousness. All things are consciousness made manifest. Consciousness is the only reality. Everything, our body, our homes, our equipment, whatever, is that consciousness showing up in the form that we have conceived and brought forth. And that's an important phrase for those of you who have tracked the Christian liturgy. We have conceived and brought forth every aspect of our experience. It can't be otherwise. Our consciousness is the only reality. And our consciousness is the one mind, the one beingness that is everywhere. So in the next slide, he gives us a process. This is his book, Your Faith is Your Fortune. With your desire defined, quietly go within and shut the door behind you. He's drawing on the reference in the Christian New Testament where Jesus says, go into your closet when you pray. But here's where Neville goes forward. Lose yourself in your desire. Stop feeling separate from it. Feel it and you as one. Feel yourself to be one with this desire. Remain in this fixation until you have absorbed the life and name this desire by claiming and feeling yourself to be and to have that which you have desired. Just lose yourself in it. Whatever it is, the perfect work, the perfect income, the perfect relationship, the perfect body, the perfect home, whatever it is, lose yourself in that hour of prayer, in that quiet place where no one else is. This is not about words, is it? This is about losing our sense of separation from the experience we're ready to have until you have absorbed it. It is fully a part of you. And sometimes when we go through this process, as I shared in a previous talk, we get to be surprised when whoops, I thought it was already here. But really, that idea that it is so fully present, so fully a part of us, is an essential next step. We go on. And he tells us in the next slide that part of us that's bringing it into form isn't concerned with whether your feeling is true or false. It isn't concerned with whether you have physically experienced this or only emotionally experienced it, right? And we remember, some of us do remember, that way back in the 70s and 80s, they were doing these exams or these tests of what the relationship is between imagination and experience. And basketball players, I have two favorite stories from that time. And one is the basketball players. They divided the team into three groups, and one group was in there, every day shooting the hoops and, going around on the court and getting the ball from each other and shooting the hoops and doing the free throws and all the things that come with being a good basketball player. A second group was told, spend the same amount of time at the same time imagining doing all of those things. Feel yourself doing all those things. Allow all those things to happen in your awareness. The third group was told to sit on the couch at the same amount of time and simply rest. Well, if you haven't heard the results of that story, I'm sure you've already figured them out. And that is, the guys who practiced every day did really, really well. The guys who imagined practicing did as well as or better than the ones who were out there on the court. And the guys who just hung out, well, they didn't do very well at all. So it wasn't a function of being on the court or not being on the court. That's what the third group teaches us, right? It was a function of being in the experience fully, right? It doesn't matter to that part of us that is bringing the experience into our awareness, into our physical experience, whether it's something we've done physically or not. We feel it so fully that we must have been doing it, and our bodies respond to that, right? My other favorite story on that is around the Vietnam era. You may be aware that a number of American pilots were shot down. They were kept as prisoners of war by the North Vietnamese. And there's a story of one guy who was a golfer, and he was kept in solitary a lot, like weeks and weeks of solitary. And after almost 2 years in the prisoner of war camp, he was released. They managed to do a trade. And the people who were coming out of Vietnam by air in the Air Force were shipped immediately to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. And it happened that the day after his plane arrived from Vietnam, there was a pro-am tournament in golf at Clark Air Force Base, professionals and amateurs playing together. Well, out of courtesy and honoring this man who's been in hell for months, they knew he liked golf, so they included him in the tournament. He blew them away. He was making the best possible scores on every hole. And when it was all over, they said, "What? How? Tell us." And he said, "Well, when I was in solitary, I was playing golf. I knew this course, and I continued to play it over and over again." And he played other courses too while he was in solitary. He had played it so well that even though his body had been abused, his mental faculties were barely functioning, he could play that course. Yes, the subconscious is not concerned with whether you've had the physical experience or the imagined experience. The imagined experience is every bit as powerful. So feeling that it's done, it's here, I have it, it is complete, the world is at peace, my body is healed, these relationships are healthy, whatever it is, that is the key that Neville brings for the New Thought movement. And then he goes on to say in the next slide, because of this quality of the subconscious, there is nothing impossible to, he says, man, to humanity, to anyone. Nothing impossible. Whatever the mind of humanity can conceive and feel as true, the subconscious can and must objectify. Must. This is fundamental new thought. It is fundamental to how, as we let go of old ways of thinking and feeling, we begin to create a whole new life. In the next slide, we see Neville with his final wife there in Los Angeles. And we see him with his daughter from his second wife and his grandson there in Los Angeles. Neville Goddard, married 3 times, in love every time, and then clear in a couple of them, whoops, this isn't going to work, but moving on, always moving on. His dancing career ended during the Depression. He replaced it with a career as a lecturer and writer, and was quite successful for all of those who were thinking you can't be successful at it. He finally passed quietly in his home in 1972. And there is a link there, and I hope you will pause the video and copy that link, or you will look up on YouTube Neville Goddard's final lecture, because in that lecture, he tells us some wonderful things. The name of the lecture is God and I Are One. God and I are one. Remember when I was saying that he was determined that we would experience that. If we didn't experience that, we wouldn't be able to accomplish anything, right? So I'm going to give you some of the language from there. He says, you hear the word God, the word Jehovah, the word Lord, the word Jesus, the word Christ, and you think of something other than yourself, one that is greater, one that you would worship. He says, tonight it is my purpose to show you that God and the I of man are one. When you say, I am, that is the God of the scripture. Confined as you are by your body, you think, how could that be? When God created the universe and sustains it, and here I am, a little being on the planet. Now, he then turns to scripture to explain that. And he says, Jesus asked, who do men say that the Son of Man is? And they come up with a variety of things. And then he said, but who do you say that I am? And Peter answered and said, thou art the Christ. And he said to him, blessed art thou, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood could not have told you this. He is equating, Goddard is telling us, the Son of Man with the I that is all of us. Not the organ that sees, but our sense of awareness, the I am, our consciousness, our human imagination. And he goes on for 45 more minutes in that lecture. It was his final lecture. Literally, he left the planet just days after doing this last lecture. And one has to think that he understood, finally, that he was no longer separated from the source of all that is, and that he didn't have to stay in the planetary plane, if you will, the plane of apparent separation. He knew and felt and so experienced his oneness with the consciousness that, as he knew, is the only reality. Thank you very much for joining me today. It's been a delight to share this other branch of the New Thought movement.